Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we're diving into one of the most emotional chapters of this incredible story. After giving up his fortune and celebrating his daughter's first birthday in a humble countryside home, the CEO finally discovers a happiness money could never buy. But can this fragile peace really last? Just as laughter fills their little home, a mysterious luxury car returns, and a chilling message about the CEO's hospitalized father threatens to destroy everything they've rebuilt. Who is secretly watching Tieu Lac and the CEO, and will they be forced to leave their peaceful life behind once again? Stay with us until the very end to uncover the shocking truth. And if you enjoy emotional family dramas packed with suspense, betrayal, and unexpected twists, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our next episode. Morning sunlight slowly spread across the small countryside house. Unlike the luxurious apartment they once lived in, there were no floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, no expensive furniture, no private chefs preparing breakfast. Only the gentle sound of birds singing outside and the smell of freshly cooked rice drifting from the kitchen. For the first time in many years, the CEO woke up because of laughter, not because of an alarm clock, not because of business calls, but because his little daughter was giggling as she crawled across the wooden floor. He slowly opened his eyes. The little girl noticed him immediately. "Daddy!" She stretched out both tiny arms and smiled with the purest joy. The CEO couldn't help smiling back. He lifted her into his arms and kissed her forehead. "Good morning, Princess." Tieu Lac walked out from the kitchen carrying a simple breakfast. Rice porridge, boiled eggs, fresh vegetables picked from the garden. Nothing luxurious. Yet somehow, everything tasted better than any five-star breakfast he had ever eaten. The family gathered around the small wooden table. Their daughter kept trying to feed both of them with her tiny spoon, making everyone burst into laughter. Tieu Lac's mother quietly watched from the corner, seeing her daughter smiling again after everything she had endured, brought tears to her eyes. After breakfast, the CEO noticed Tieu Lac secretly counting several folded bills inside a small envelope. She quickly hid them when she saw him looking. He smiled gently. "What are you hiding?" Tieu Lac laughed awkwardly. "It's nothing." He walked over and softly held her hand. "You've never been good at hiding things." She hesitated before finally showing him the envelope. Inside, there wasn't much money, just enough to buy a few groceries, and perhaps a very small birthday cake. The CEO suddenly remembered. Tomorrow, their daughter would turn 1 year old. His smile slowly disappeared. How could he have forgotten? Over the past few weeks, he had been busy planning their future, thinking about rebuilding his career, worrying about his father's condition, trying to protect his family. Somewhere along the way, he had nearly forgotten the most important day in his daughter's life. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Tieu Lac gently shook her head. "She doesn't need an expensive party. She only needs us." Her words comforted him, but deep inside, he still blamed himself. 1 year ago, when their daughter was born, he had promised to give her the happiest life possible. Now, he couldn't even afford a proper birthday celebration. That afternoon, while Tieu Lac was preparing dinner, the CEO quietly left the house, without telling anyone. He walked through the small village looking for temporary work. Anything, no matter how simple, no matter how difficult. An elderly carpenter recognized him. "Looking for work?" The CEO smiled. "If you'll have me." The old man looked at his clean hands and laughed. City people usually quit after 1 hour. The CEO smiled confidently. "I'll try." For the rest of the afternoon, he carried heavy wood, repaired broken fences, loaded construction materials. His hands became covered with dust, his shoulders ached, Sweat soaked through his shirt, yet he never complained once. As the sun began to set, the carpenter handed him a small envelope. "It isn't much." The CEO accepted it with both hands. "Thank you." Walking home, he looked inside. The money wasn't enough to change their lives, but it was the very first income he had earned entirely on his own. Not because of his family name, not because he was a CEO, simply because of his own hard work. For some reason, he smiled the entire way home. The next morning, the little house became unusually lively. Today, their daughter officially turned 1 year old. Tieu Lac woke up before sunrise. She decorated the house using colorful paper flowers made by hand, old ribbons, tiny balloons bought from the village market. Simple decorations, filled with love. Her mother prepared every dish their granddaughter liked: sticky rice, sweet soup, steamed chicken, fresh fruit from the garden. Meanwhile, the CEO quietly slipped outside once again. A short while later, he returned carrying something carefully hidden behind his back. Tieu Lac immediately became curious. "What did you buy?" He smiled mysteriously. "You'll see later." By noon, everything was ready. The dining table wasn't filled with expensive food. There were no luxury gifts, no famous guests, no photographers, no media. Only 4 people: a grandmother, a mother, a father, and one beautiful little girl wearing a tiny white dress. The CEO placed a small birthday cake onto the table. It wasn't large, it wasn't professionally decorated. Its cream wasn't perfectly smooth, but standing in the center was one tiny candle shaped like the number 1. Tieu Lac looked at him in surprise. "You bought this?" He scratched his head shyly. "I made it with the baker." "It doesn't look very good." She suddenly laughed. "It's perfect." The little girl clapped excitedly without understanding why everyone looked so happy. Together, they began singing Happy Birthday. Their voices weren't perfectly in tune, but every word carried genuine love. The little girl happily smashed both hands into the cake. Cream immediately covered her tiny face. Everyone burst into uncontrollable laughter. The CEO laughed so hard that tears nearly rolled down his cheeks. He had attended countless luxurious birthday parties, 5-star hotels, celebrity guests, fireworks, million-dollar decorations. None of them had ever felt this warm. After lunch, the CEO quietly handed his daughter a tiny wooden toy. Hand-carved, simple, its surface wasn't perfectly polished. "I made it last night," he admitted nervously. Tieu Lac looked at him in surprise. "You made this?" He nodded. "The carpenter taught me." The little girl immediately hugged the toy tightly, as if it were the greatest treasure in the world. Watching that simple moment, the CEO suddenly lowered his head. "I'm sorry," he whispered again. Tieu Lac gently touched his shoulder. "What are you apologizing for?" He looked toward his daughter. She should have had a grand birthday. She should have had everything. Instead, he looked around the small house. "I've only given both of you hardship." Tieu Lac quietly took his hand, then looked directly into his eyes. "You've given us something much more valuable." He looked confused. She smiled softly. "You came home every evening. You ate dinner with us. You watched your daughter grow. You laughed. You smiled. You became a father, instead of only being a CEO." The CEO remained speechless. Outside, a gentle breeze moved through the trees. Laughter continued echoing inside the tiny house. For just one afternoon, it truly felt as though every hardship had disappeared. But far away, parked beneath the shade of several large trees at the entrance of the village, a familiar black luxury sedan quietly waited. Its engine remained off, its windows completely dark. Someone inside slowly raised a camera. The lens focused directly on the small countryside house where Tieu Lac, the CEO, and their daughter were celebrating her very first birthday together. The birthday celebration continued long into the afternoon. No expensive presents, no famous guests, no luxurious decorations, only laughter echoing through the little wooden house. For the CEO, it was the most beautiful celebration he had ever attended. Their daughter sat on the floor, surrounded by colorful wrapping paper. She seemed far more interested in the empty boxes than the gifts themselves. Every time she crawled into one of them, everyone laughed. Tieu Lac's mother quietly watched from nearby. She folded her hands together, looking at the young family before her. A year ago, she had worried that her daughter would never smile again. Now, despite all the hardships, that smile had finally returned. As the afternoon sun slowly faded, several neighbors arrived carrying small homemade gifts. One family brought fresh eggs, another offered baskets of fruit. Someone else carried homemade rice cakes. None of the gifts were expensive, yet every one of them came with sincere blessings. The CEO stood at the doorway, greeting everyone personally. Again and again, people thanked him for helping repair fences, carrying crops, and assisting elderly villagers during the past few weeks. One elderly woman smiled warmly. "You may have come from the city, but you've become one of us." Those simple words touched him deeply. Back in the city, people respected his position. Here, people respected his character. The difference was greater than he had ever imagined. That evening, after the guests returned home, the family sat together in the quiet yard. The little girl had fallen asleep in Tieu Lac's arms. A cool breeze drifted across the rice fields. Fireflies danced in the darkness. For a long time, no one spoke. Sometimes, silence itself could become the happiest conversation. Finally, the CEO looked toward the sky. "I used to believe success meant standing at the top." He smiled quietly. "But now, I think success is being able to watch my daughter sleep every night." Tieu Lac gently leaned against his shoulder. "You've changed." He nodded. "I had to. I spent years chasing profits. I missed birthdays. I missed dinners. I missed ordinary moments." He looked toward his sleeping daughter. "I don't want to miss another one." Tieu Lac smiled. "Then don't." The CEO slowly reached into his pocket. He took out a folded piece of paper. It was filled with handwritten notes, business plans, investment ideas, lists of potential clients, simple calculations. Tieu Lac looked at it curiously. "You've been working again?" He nodded. "I'm starting from zero. No family connections, no inheritance, no company. If I return one day, I want to return because I deserve it." Tieu Lac gently held his hand. "I've never doubted you." Those words became the greatest encouragement he could have received. The following morning, the peaceful routine continued. The CEO left early to help the carpenter. Tieu Lac went to the local market. Her mother stayed home caring for the little girl. Everything seemed perfectly normal, until a young boy from the village ran toward the carpenter's workshop. Breathing heavily, "Brother," he shouted, "someone's looking for you." The CEO frowned. "Who?" "I don't know. They're waiting near the village entrance." The CEO immediately put down his tools. His instincts warned him that something wasn't right. He walked toward the entrance alone. The closer he came, the quieter everything became. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. Parked beneath a large banyan tree was the same black luxury sedan that had appeared days earlier. The rear door slowly opened. A man in an elegant black suit stepped out. He bowed politely. "Mr. CEO." The CEO remained expressionless. "I'm no longer the CEO." The man smiled faintly, perhaps not officially, but many people still see you that way. "What do you want?" The man reached into his briefcase. He handed over a sealed envelope. "Someone asked me to deliver this." The CEO didn't take it immediately. "Who?" "I'm not authorized to say." After a brief silence, the CEO accepted the envelope. Inside, there was only one photograph: his father, still lying unconscious in the hospital. On the back, a single sentence had been written by hand: "If you stay in the village, you'll regret it forever." The CEO's eyes narrowed. He looked up, but the man had already returned to the car. Within seconds, the luxury sedan disappeared down the dusty road. He stood there for several minutes, holding the photograph tightly. His heartbeat grew heavier. Someone wanted him to return to the city. But why? Was his father's condition worsening? Or was this another trap? Meanwhile, back at the hospital, the chairman's condition suddenly changed. The heart monitor became unstable. Doctors rushed into the room. Nurses hurried through the hallway. The chief physician immediately reviewed the latest medical results. Something wasn't right. The unauthorized sedatives had completely disappeared from the chairman's bloodstream. Someone had stopped administering them. As the doctor leaned closer, the chairman's eyelids trembled, very slightly. Then, for the first time in months, his fingers moved, not once, not by accident, but deliberately. The doctor quickly leaned closer. "Mr. Chairman, can you hear me?" The chairman couldn't speak. He couldn't even open his eyes. But his weak fingers slowly traced something across the bedsheet. One letter, then another. The doctor struggled to understand. Finally, he recognized the first character. It wasn't a name. It wasn't a word. It was simply, M. Before he could finish, the chairman lost consciousness once again. The doctor stared at the unfinished message. His heart raced. M. Did it stand for medicine? A person's name? Or someone much closer? At that exact moment, hundreds of kilometers away, the CEO folded the photograph and slipped it into his pocket. He looked toward his home. Inside, Tieu Lac was laughing with their daughter, completely unaware of what had just happened. He forced himself to smile before walking through the front gate. He didn't want them to worry. Not yet. But deep inside, he knew the peaceful days were coming to an end. The first birthday they had celebrated together might also be the last truly carefree memory before fate forced them back into the storm they had tried so desperately to leave behind. And somewhere in the distance, someone was already making the next move, waiting for the CEO to choose once again between protecting the family he loved or returning to confront the enemies who had stolen everything from him. After leaving behind wealth and power, the CEO, Tieu Lac, and their daughter celebrate her first birthday in a humble countryside home surrounded only by family and love. Although the celebration is simple, filled with handmade decorations, a small cake, and heartfelt laughter, the CEO feels guilty for not giving his wife and daughter the luxurious life they once had. Tieu Lac reminds him that his presence and love are worth more than any fortune. Inspired by her faith, he begins rebuilding his future from nothing through honest work. However, their happiness is short-lived. A mysterious luxury car returns to the village, and the CEO receives a chilling photograph of his hospitalized father with a threatening message. Meanwhile, his father's condition begins to improve, hinting that long-buried secrets may soon surface. Can the CEO protect his family before danger reaches their peaceful new life?